Let me remind you that if you have not watched part 1 and 2 of this series, please do so. And as a matter of warning, I need to tell you that any resemblance to real people in the words that follow is purely coincidental. I have never even observed anyone carving their initials in the bark of an aspen tree, let alone talked to them or delved into their actual backgrounds. I have simply made up stories about them for the fun of it. If you happen to recognize your name or your initials or phrases, it's entirely up to you whether or not you want to disseminate that information. After all, maybe JM no longer loves PD and does not want DC to know anything about PD. With that in mind, please enjoy the stories that follow. Chapter 10, Ernesto, also known as the Big Chief. Ernesto came to the United States in the mid-1950s with several others. There were literally colonies of his favorite immigrants, but he was a very lonely man. Ernesto's ancestors had been among those who sailed with Magellan. They were shipbuilders who had no equals. Basque country was a part of the Kingdom of Castile, and scores of those people ended up in the New World after Columbus made his discoveries. But Ernesto was a lonely man. He had few friends, but he had relatives. None of the Latin American countries are without Basque genetic makeup of one kind or another. But all those people in all those places still left Ernesto a lonely man. There are records that show that there were as many as 50,000 Basques in the United States by the time Ernesto had the necessary paperwork to immigrate. An uncle that he had never met planned his plight. The original plan was for Ernesto to go to Idaho, where many Basques settled following their failure in the California goldfields. They were now shepherds, and many had their own sheep operations. By the time Ernesto came into the country, it was almost assumed that if a rancher had sheep, he employed at least one Basque to take care of the sheep. As immigrants from Latin America countries were replacing the Basque shepherds, a few Basques managed to secure large flocks of sheep and were becoming very successful. Such was the case with Ernesto's uncle, who found a niche in Colorado and sent Ernesto there to manage a large number of sheep in the western mountains of the state. Most people would not endure the hardships that came with managing large flocks of sheep in a literal wilderness where human contact was rare. Weather could be brutal, and basic human necessities came at a high price in the form of self-endurance. As soon as Ernesto arrived in western Colorado, a ranch manager met with him, equipped him with a bundle of clothes, and put him into a pickup truck and drove nearly 2 hours on roads that could not really be described as roads at all. He was shown his new home, which was a contraption not much different than the Conestoga wagons that once crossed the vast prairies. This one had rubber tires instead of wood wheels, and the top was made of tin rather than canvas. There was a small stove used for both heat and cooking, and there was a bed, which was little more than a few planks covered with a thin feather mattress. Ernesto was introduced to the flock and a dog. He was given a Winchester .30-30 rifle, and then he was left alone. He was assured that someone would come in his camp every 2 weeks or so to deliver the basic supplies. For several years, Ernesto's mother insisted that Ernesto learn English, This was prior to his immigration, of course. She promised him that his uncle was soon to become a very important rancher in the United States, and that he promised his sister that her son would have the opportunity to be a wealthy American. So, Ernesto could speak French, Spanish, and English. His new companion, a black and white border collie, understood only whistles and sign language. The sheep didn't care much what language Ernesto spoke. The first week of Ernesto's isolation became almost unbearable to him. By the time the ranch manager showed up with a few provisions and some greetings from his uncle, Ernesto was ready to call the whole plan off. He had yet to meet his uncle. He yearned for some interaction with a human, any human. But the ranch manager was a man of few words and stayed only long enough to drink a cup of hot tea and assure Ernesto that his benefactor would be coming to the camp within a few days. The very evening after the ranch manager left, Ernesto carved a small image on an aspen tree. His intention was to carve a portrait of his mother. The image did not really resemble her at all, but it was sufficient for him to sit near and talk to her as if she was actually there in the camp with him. It made him feel just a little closer to home, the home that he missed so much. Several days later, Ernesto's uncle finally arrived in the camp. Uncle Louis brought him a new cast iron Dutch oven filled with manmataco, a classic Basque stew made from tuna, potatoes, onions, tomatoes, and choricero peppers. The stew is cooked slowly with lots of garlic. As Ernesto placed the kettle on the coals of a campfire, Uncle Louis filled him in on the news from home and told him of the plans. Ernesto would work in the mountains with the sheep until the fall of the year, when the sheep would be herded out of the high country. The sale of the lambs and the wool would result in money for necessities and a small salary. Ernesto would spend the winter on Luis's property in the valley and help with the work there. Part of his meager pay would be in the form of sheep. Ernesto would be allowed to tend his own sheep with the main flock until he acquired enough sheep to have his own flock. Further plans would be made when the time came. Meanwhile, Luis would help Ernesto with the necessary paperwork and guide him through the process to become an American citizen. The day after Luis's visit, Ernesto carved another image in the tree. This one was meant to be a reproduction of a portrait of his parents that hung in their living quarters at home. Again, it did not look much like the intended subject, but it was symbolic, and it helped Ernesto feel less lonely. One day, two young boys from a nearby town visited Ernesto. They sat in his camp and asked many questions. Somehow they formed the opinion that Ernesto must be an Indian. When they asked about the tree carvings, he tried to explain, but his explanation resulted only in more questions. It was then that the words "Big Chief" were carved into the tree. The boys visited several times that year and began calling Ernesto Chief. He didn't mind. In fact, he enjoyed the company, and the three of them became friends and stayed friends for many years to come. The boys, over the year, brought fresh venison to Ernesto. He would make stew and share it with them. It was 7 years before Ernesto became a citizen, and his two friends attended the ceremony where he pledged his allegiance to the United States. By then, he was a sheep owner in his own right, and was beginning to negotiate grazing contracts from local landowners. He never returned to his childhood home and never again saw his parents. The tree, high in the Colorado mountains, became a memorial to the parents who loved him so much that they sent him away to pursue happiness. Chapter 11. Tina. Tina. I can always think and say the right things when you cannot hear. The words flow from my heart and I usually shed a tear. How well I recall those summer days when we first met. The memories are there, and I will never forget. You came into my life in an accidental way, and I never for a moment thought you would want to stay. The first time you sat right next to me in the front seat of my car. The first time we held hands at the table in the bar. The time you moved my hand when it brushed across your breast. They are all permanent memories stored among the rest. You told me of your home 1,000 miles away, where you were surrounded by scores of people each and every day. You came into my world of mountains and rivers and trees, a place with no freeways, no oceans, no seas. In my narrow way of thinking, I could not understand that rather than a lush green meadow, you preferred a beach of sand. Our paths crossed, they collided to say the least, but one was headed west, the other to the east. The day that you left is now so long past. How well you explain that romances with distance rarely ever last. You promised to write, but I knew that you knew better, and I did not spend much time waiting for your letter. On the very day I kissed you and watched you fly away, I knew you were going home and there would likely stay. I went into the mountains as lonely as I could be. I stored your memory in my heart and carved your name into a tree. Chapter 12. R.W. Saturday, October 15th, 1994, was an important day for R.W. The big game season for which he held an elk license opened that day. It was not R.W.'s first elk hunting trip, but it was the first time he drew a coveted either sex elk license for the game management area where big bull elk were reputed to hang out. R.W. rationalized that should he not get a bull in the first few days, he could concentrate on getting a cow as a sort of consolation prize. There were drawbacks. The area was also known to have the best population of elk later in the year after snow drove the animals out of the high country. While R.W.'s choice of where he camped was by no means in low country, his equipment prevented him from getting much higher. His camp of choice was located at an elevation of about 8,000 feet, and he had an ample amount of U.S. forest land to hunt. But his four-wheel drive pickup had his camper mounted on it, and that handicapped his movements. His brother also had a four-wheel drive vehicle, but could only hunt the weekend, leaving R.W. on foot after 2 days of negative results. There had been no significant snow in the area, and there were few signs of elk even being there. On Tuesday morning, R.W. was tired. He had tromped the hills and mountains now for 3 days without any encouragement. The morning was chilly at about 28 degrees. His feet were sore, and as he gathered wood for his fire, he felt an urge to just sit next to that fire and think about how to approach the hunt. He knew it was not a good idea to hunt alone, but he had little choice in the matter that year. Close to R.W.'s camp was a small stand of aspen trees. The bigger aspen growths were somewhat higher in elevation. The dead aspen provided for relatively easily attained firewood, and as it turned out, one of them provided an unfortunate diversion. Using a folding hunting knife, R.W. began carving on one of the trees. First he carved his initials, then the date, and finally he carved a frame around his work. As he stood admiring his handiwork, there was a loud crashing sound just to the west of where he stayed. 2 cow elk crashed through nearby spruce trees. They stopped only 25 yards from R.W., and one of the cows looked over her shoulder. She was looking at a huge 6-point bull, which was standing broadside to R.W. One problem. R.W.'s rifle was 15 steps away, unloaded, and in his camper. He slowly inched his way to the camper door. The elk stood still. As he opened the door, one of the cows perked up. She was watching. R.W. managed to get the rifle out, but the sound of the bolt being drawn back alerted the bull, and all 3 of the elk jumped and disappeared into the spruce trees. R.W. spent the rest of the day and 2 more days walking around the area. Each time he passed over the trail where the elk passed, he shook his head in disbelief. 4 years later, R.W. was in the same spot. This time he was better prepared. He had an ATV, and his brother was also able to spend the week in camp with him. By then, he had told the story many times, and he once again recalled the day and he showed his brother the carving on the tree. "I was standing right here," he said, shaking his head. "That bull was standing right over there by that spruce tree, the one with the hanging branch." The boys hunted for 3 days without seeing anything. It snowed a little, leaving about a half inch on the ground Monday night. But Tuesday morning did not reveal any elk activity in the area. Both men had over-the-counter bull licenses and were a little discouraged. R.W.'s brother suggested that R.W. should maybe carve his initials in the tree again. Maybe that would bring some luck. This time, R.W.'s brother could stand by and be prepared. On the same tree, and with the same knife, R.W. carves his initials once again, only with the 1998 date. He once again carved a frame around the work, all the while glancing at his brother and listening for the sound of an approaching elk. Nothing. To add insult to injury, the wind began blowing at a steady 15 miles an hour, making the day miserable. The men returned to camp after just a short hike around the area and spent the remainder of the afternoon playing cribbage in the camper. There was no elk meat in R.W.'s freezer that year, and he never hunted that area again. He never carved another aspen tree, but frequently tells the story. Chapter 13. The Devil. My name doesn't matter right now, and up until recently, my life didn't matter much either. I was a loner, a person roaming around without much purpose in life. That all changed recently, but I want to talk a little bit about those days when I was lost. Lost to my family, my friends, and most of all, lost to myself. There's a little stick figure carved on an aspen tree in Colorado that epitomizes those times. During most of my childhood, I didn't have many friends. Oh, there were some neighborhood kids that I hung around with, and I tried at the insistence of my mother to be part of the Cub Scout pack, but those things did not develop friends. Then something happened that changed all that. I don't remember the exact date or, for that matter, the exact year, but a kid named Billy proved to have a lot in common with me, and we became friends. We did things together. We went fishing and hiking. We built one of those boyhood forts that we believed was exclusive just to the two of us. We stocked our fort with canned fruit cocktail and sardines. We feasted on Vienna sausages and speculated about the Indians who once lived in the area, perhaps even in that exact location where our fort was. Billy was the product of a broken home. His father and his mother managed to place his life on the sidelines as they focused on screwing up their own lives. Billy was pretty much on his own. I think I was the only friend he had, and that was okay with me. Unlike Billy, I had two parents living in the same house. I had a sister, and I could depend on having clothes to wear and food to eat. But my family life was not what most people would call a good one. We didn't do things together. Oh, we ate meals at the same table and sat in the same room to watch some stupid sitcom on television. But we didn't do things. So Billy and I did things. We didn't do really destructive things, and most of the people of the time would probably describe them as being mischievous or ornery, like the time when we took a spool of monofilament fishing line, tied the end of it to a girl's front bicycle wheel, and hid behind a short bush where the rest of the spool rested in the grass. We had just enough slack to provide a good distance before the line, which was wrapping itself up in the wheel, pulled the spool out of the grass and sent it bouncing down the street behind her as the line just kept building up around the wheel. It worked far better than we imagined and made a hell of a mess around the front forks of that front wheel. Somehow, this little bike rider managed to cross over the line as it went slack. And while looking over her shoulder to determine what was making the racket behind her, in the process, the line started wrapping around the chain sprocket. She didn't wreck or anything, but it was damn funny. After one of our little deeds, we would sit in the fort and laugh about it, always saying the same thing. The devil made me do it. I remember that devil explanation did not sit very well when we tried to use it to explain why we coated a chalkboard eraser with Vaseline. It made the board shine, but it resulted in a really intense visit to the principal's office. I should have disposed of that jar of Vaseline. They used it as evidence. I really didn't think someone would actually search our coat pockets, and Billy experienced a true example of guilt by association. Then, one day, something happened that literally changed our lives. It was an early summer day. School was out for the year, and the day had all the promises of being a very boring one, to say the least. I roamed around the neighborhood, but didn't run into Billy. I decided to go to the fort. As I entered our private lair, I was somewhat surprised to find Billy curled up with an old army blanket and fast asleep. When he awakened and saw me, he explained his plight. He had run away from home. Billy explained that things just got too intense at his house. His mother had taken to slapping him around and threatened him to send him off to his father's home, which was 200 miles away. His father was much more abusive than his mother, and Billy was adamant that he just wouldn't go. He said he was going to live in the fort for the rest of the summer while he made up his mind and figured out his next move. The next few days started as an adventure. I was sneaking food from my house to supply Billy with what we deemed necessary for his survival. The whole town was looking for Billy, and the sheriff questioned me twice in 2 days. But I remained steadfast during those first days. I told everyone that I had not seen Billy and had no knowledge of his whereabouts. On about the 5th day, the adventure turned to somewhat entirely different thing. Once again, I had to deal with the sheriff. This time my parents and some lady from the Department of Social Services was there. They made a compelling argument that Billy needed help, and that if I knew his whereabouts, I was only hurting him by not telling. On that day, I betrayed the only friend I had. The sheriff and the Department of Social Services lady went to our fort and gathered Billy up. My parents told me that he was emaciated, dehydrated, and an emotional wreck. I know better, but that seemed to be the story, and they, all those know-it-all adults, were sticking to it. The end result was that Billy was placed into a foster care in another town. His parents ultimately lost their parental standing, and Billy was adopted. I didn't see him again for over 20 years. I spent more hours in our fort than I can count, lamenting my decision. Then I tore the fort down and I carved a stick figure on a nearby aspen tree. The figure was that of the devil, because my only explanation for betraying my friend was the devil made me do it. That 20-year reunion took place just a few days ago. I learned that Billy held no animosity, and in fact thanked me for what I did. I learned that he ended up having a wonderful life with his adopted parents, and the burden he lifted from my shoulders that day somehow made my life have more meaning. And one thing's for sure, the devil will never again make me do anything. Chapter 14, What Love Has to Do with It. I do not think that discussion of past romantic relationships with a current partner is appropriate or advisable. It seems to me that doing so will never result in good things. For that reason, like some of the other contributors to this missive, I will not use my name, nor will I refer to anyone herein by their given name. The fact is, however, that we tend to remember those past encounters and relationships, and we often tend to remember the good with enhancements and the bad with omissions. To say otherwise, I submit, is less than honest. Ask just about anyone about their first kiss, and you'll not get a description of some peck on the cheek in the school playground that was brought on by a group of one sort or another challenging a group of another sort to kiss you on the cheek. No, I'm talking about that first kiss. That one that lingered just a little extra moment. The one where the kisser's lips felt so soft and had just a little quiver. I'm talking about that kiss that left you almost breathless and searching for words that either failed to form or came out terribly wrong. First loves, unlike first kisses, are much harder to define. I often wonder if those who have had only one sweetheart in their lives were somewhat cheated. I wonder if they really fell in love, or did they simply become so accustomed to being with each other that they defined that familiarity as love? I was never a blatant fan of Shakespeare, but like many before me, and I hope many to come, the works of that poet of poets was part of my early education. I would never have admitted to my peers, but Shakespeare's sonnets seem to me to have real meaning. I never memorized any of the sonnets, but have many times looked them up just to experience Shakespeare's definition of love. For he defines it much better than any dictionary or accepted reference book. In the context of what I am referring to, here's a simple part of Sonnet 16. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. My point, I guess, is that true love lasts forever. But that does not mean that former feelings of what was then thought to be true love were not sincere. That day when I carved the word love into the bark of an aspen tree, I did so not because I was convinced that I was in love, but more because I was confused. The truth is that I stood back and threw my pocket knife at the word, trying to stick the blade and thereby really show my frustration with the whole concept of love. In today's world, that action alone might well define me as some sort of deviant, but I had no hate for the person who so recently left me, and I certainly was not contemplating any sort of violence against that person. I was simply frustrated and confused. I sat and stared at the carving for a long time before I decided that life must go on. I now look back at those past relationships as a training ground of sorts. A brief time in my life when my ability to appreciate not only loving, but also being loved